it's too risky to rely on generative AI to make a decision, because what happens when it's wrong?
Right.
So the other side of the coin that, not only people talk about is we have ChatGPT, but what about the bad actors? The fraud GPT or the chaos GPT. There's all these different ones that have been coined that are out there to I'll say wreak havoc.
Today I have Kevin Shamoun on, 20 years plus in the payment industry, founder of the Zeemster Gateway technology, which was later acquired by Fortis. I've worked with Kevin hand in hand for quite some time. Kevin, welcome to the Embedded Podcast.
Thanks. I mean, great to be here.
Yeah, nice to see you. Hope everything's going well. Not that I don't see you all the time anyway, but officially,
For sure.
Cameras are on, microphones are on. I got to say that,
of
to
course.
be official. Okay, cool. So a couple things that we want to talk about today, a few things. The focus is AI, artificial intelligence. We're going to be talking a little bit about that. But before we dig into artificial intelligence, what this means, there's a lot of different terminology. People are confused as to what is and what isn't. We want to learn a little bit about who is Kevin Shamoun. I can tell the audience here that I know you have a love for hockey and family. I'll start with those two, and I'll let you kind of take it from there.
Yeah,
and
sure.
Talk a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, played hockey since I was a little kid, and my kids play hockey now, and I coach their teams. It's a lot of fun. I'll say a big passion for it. Starting up a fantasy league with my son with a bunch of his friends coming up here soon, so that's going to be exciting as well. Hockey fantasy, correct? Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah,
Nice.
Yeah.
And is being that you can't skate on ice and only on rollerblades, is that an issue for hockey? No, I'm just kidding. I know that you can skate on ice.
I do both, actually.
Okay, you do. You got both under control.
I play roller hockey in a men's league. I think I'm actually one of the oldest in the league. Fun fact for you.
Another little interesting thing that I had learned about you some time ago. So substitute teacher does not show up for class. So your teacher is out. Substitute teacher doesn't show up. Remind me how old you were at this point when this occurred.
I was probably a sophomore in high school.
Sophomore in high school. I'm imagining the classroom here. No substitute teacher. Tell the folks out there what occurred.
So substitute says, "Is Kevin here?" And I raise my hand, think I'm in trouble because that wasn't out of the norm for me. And she says, "Can you come here?" And she says, "Hey," hands me a piece of paper, and she says, "Kevin will teach class today." And I was like, okay. So I went to the board, and it was a programming class. So I just, started teaching really what the teacher wanted to kind of go over that day. And, it's like a 5 or 10 minute lesson that everyone goes back and tries to work on their projects. But
unbelievable.
So.
And you were coding you're sophomore in high school, figure what, that's 15 years old or so.
Yeah.
How many years did you have under your belt at that point in time of development?
Probably a few.
Okay.
So I started back when the Apple IIe compatible computers back in the day. I'll age myself there a little bit.
Yeah.
So, but
Apple IIe. Okay, cool. And then since then, fell in love with it and just kept rolling with development.
Just kept rolling with it, and technology and, all the things that come with it. It's just, it's been my forte.
Yeah. Are you a green or a blue guy before we really get into the AI stuff? Like when I text message you, does it come up green or blue? Because I think the audience also would kind of like to hear from an authority perspective where how loyal you are to what brand.
I was green for a long time.
Oh, I remember.
And I'm blue now.
Okay, awesome.
Primarily because of the family.
Yeah.
And my wife's desire to make it easy for us to all, communicate more.
That's awesome.
So
yeah.
One thing that I found interesting is when I did switch phones, I got invited to more chat groups. There's a social bias out there if you don't have an Apple phone, I found out, which is like this unspoken rule I didn't know.
Well, it really limits the ability to use the tool once you have a green in there. So it's interesting. But, I was really happy the day that you went blue. I loved you either way, though, just so you know. All right, let's dig in a little bit here. Artificial intelligence. There's kind of 3 major points that we want to hit. Overall, as it relates to artificial intelligence and how it's affecting the world in general, that's something we want to talk about. What those hot buttons are. There's a lot of press around what's happening with Amazon and Google and Microsoft, and they're calling it the race of AI. So we want to talk a little bit about that. We also want to see if we can get into your experience as it relates to payments specifically and how AI is affecting payments, not just for the payment industry, for those that are payment professionals, but also how software providers may want to look at this downstream to business owners, further downstream to the consumer. So you kind of have, what affects the software affects the business owner, affects the business owner,
Sure.
affects the consumer. And there's a lot of value that can come out from solid AI. What does that even mean? That's another topic that we really want to hit on there. And then, of course, we know that you have a lot of experience because you are actually the on the chair, the vice chair, is that correct?
Yep.
Of the Artificial Intelligence Committee for the Electronic Transaction Association, ETA. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means as
Sure.
well. And I'm, thinking to myself, what is this ETA? We'll start kind of in reverse order and start working our way backwards. And I know we'll talk more about that later as it relates to the ETA itself. But Electronic Transaction Association, who are they? What do they do exactly?
Sure. It's a trade group that represents essentially the acquiring industry for payments. So you have Visa, MasterCard, Discover, American Express, all of the big guys there as well. You have, I believe, Microsoft and Google and Amazon are members as well. So you have a pretty broad swath of companies. ETA does a lot of things, and one of the things that why I want to be on the committee is to try to get back to the industry and the community as well. Right. So from a experience perspective, a lot of people come to the meetings for the committee, really looking to learn. So it's partly about education, and we try to develop some work product out. So whether it be a blog posting or a webinar series that ETA hosts, informational sessions, those types of things.
Yeah, and I would imagine also from my years of understanding and being a member of the ETA that, those bleeding edge technologies that affect payments or affect our industry, it is part of the responsibility to bring that to the forefront and make sure that some of these things make it into market as well. What does, what doesn't, what that pushes into the market, and you being a part of that obviously says a lot about where things are headed, especially knowing what your capabilities are and forward thinking, which is super cool, knowing you all these years. So with that being said, let's talk about the overarching industry that is artificial intelligence. Recent news that has come out speaks of $4 billion investment made by Amazon into a product called, specifically, as I want to say it right, Anthropic. Yep. And the Anthropic product, the focus is kind of this AWS health focus for that. This race for AI. We've heard words like, companies like ChatGPT, OpenAI, you have Google competing against Microsoft. These things weren't an overnight sensation. I mean, AI itself, when you look back, I believe OpenAI, ChatGPT is going on 4 years, 3 years for some of these products that are out there. So if you could talk a little bit about the difference between the various types of AI, like what is it for somebody that is out there in the world that's like, this thing, AI, artificial intelligence, all I'm seeing is I go onto this site and I type something in and it gives me an article. ChatGPT as an example. This is what people are saying. What can you do with it? You can't do anything with it. No, there's a lot more to it, and I know that we can kind of dig in a little bit as to how we see it today, what AI and how it affects us today, and what it could become tomorrow.
Sure. So, I mean, from my perspective, I think AI is, I'll say, a generic term that gets coined when there's something new that is generated by computers.
Right.
So if you really start to think back to when computers were first, I'll say, created, you had a lot of things that were really like rules-based reasoning was sort of the beginning of it. And that's just the, the basic if then. So you could say, oh, that's not artificial intelligence, but back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, like that was groundbreaking. So fast forward a bunch of years, you start to have machine learning, which is predominantly what's dominated the talk around what AI was or is still, right? The next iteration of that really comes into some of the deep learning, which progressed into large language models, and large language models essentially is what the ChatGPTs of the world are based on. So you have a few of those that are out there. You have ChatGPT, you have Bard, which is Google's, you have Claude, which is Anthropic's. There's a whole slew of competitors out there, and there's also a variety of what I'll say open source ones. So, the competition out there is quite broad.
Would you like classify Siri as an example? Because there are all these names that are coming up,
Sure.
and everybody has a name.
Sure.
Cortana, right? Like, are we getting into this world of we're naming these quote unquote personalities, so to speak, as your assistant, and the assistant essentially is AI? So, would you classify Siri in that category?
I mean, for sure, I would say that would be a form of, I'll call it AI, right? It's responsive. It's the beginning of really, it was the natural language as opposed to typing on keyboard for ChatGPT. But that's not where it's stopping. It's going to progress. I mean, you start looking, Tesla, for example, with your car. I mean, that is a form of AI, in my opinion. So
Right.
all the cars that have the lane assist and the self-drive and those are all forms of artificial intelligence because somebody had to program them. What's really happening now in the next iteration is what's being coined as generative AI. So historically speaking, most AI has been driven based on facts. This is the first time that models have been starting to, technology has really been starting to generate new content. So I saw a headline, Adobe, you can go into like Photoshop or whatever the tools they do for video editing, or excuse me, pictures, and say, hey, add a monkey in this picture, and it'll just insert a monkey in the picture for you. Like no copy paste, nothing. It's
no level of coding or expertise. It just does it.
It just does it.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's really where it's going from an AI standpoint, and then also just like speech, understanding and speaking. So Google has a product. I don't know if you've seen videos. It's probably a couple years old now. Like you start thinking about it. It would, if you had a green phone, right? If you have an Android phone for the Pixel,
Yep.
You could actually inside the phone click a button. It would call the restaurant to make a reservation for you.
Right.
So it was like very basic, but that was the beginning of what kind of is being proliferated, I'll say, a lot more readily across the board.
Yeah, and you're seeing that, actively in reservations in general, just through even the normal Google, even without the device itself.
Sure.
I've noticed that you could actually, quote unquote, have the assistant call in and book an appointment for you.
Yeah.
That's super cool to see. And that's just kind of the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, because you're right. All of a sudden, I'm driving the Tesla. The first time it veers me off to the right, I take control. It asks me what happened. I tell it. The next day, it doesn't. It stays on the right track. So it's pretty amazing to see where that's going. When you talk about industries and industries that are going to be affected by the difference between, the machine learning, say, and the generative learning, is that where the two kind of scenarios are there?
I would say that's
Are they married in the back end at all, or
not necessarily, because generative AI is created from essentially the model, right? It's from the computer itself. It's almost like it's thinking.
Yeah.
Where machine learning is more fact-based. So it's taking a set of data, analyzing it, and just really pointing out things. It's not coming up with an answer on its own. That's
Right.
probably the biggest difference.
Yeah, and there are talks about some basic fundamentals that are, you've already kind of talked about some 1.0 stuff is what it sounds like. Not that people have identified it as 1.0, but certainly I think we could argue that these are 1.0 issues. When we get into 2.0, I think that in my opinion, what I'm seeing is a lot of back-end processes being solved, data entry, things of that nature. And then maybe 5.0, what that might look like is where you're seeing the Anthropics of the world start to talk about moral responsibility. So before we get into the back-end processes and those types of things, what is this moral conversation that's happening as you understand it? And what are people's fears as it relates to kind of the moral responsibility for AI companies that are going out there? I mean, I've heard a couple of things of people cheating on their tests in college, right? And it'll write a paper for you, or whatever the case is there. What are you seeing from your perspective?
I mean, it's I'll coin iRobot if you've seen the movie with Will Smith.
I've seen the movie with Will Smith.
That's kind of one thought that comes to mind is like, how crazy is it going to become out there when you start to put this model or this this technology inside of a bot, right? I mean, I think everyone's seen I'll say the dog, if you will. I forgot which company that created it, but it's like fully autonomous, can jump and do flips, and they have robots now that can walk like humans and do all those things. So when are they going to start to marry those together? That's like what I see the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, and that's the part that I think really probably could potentially scare people.
Yeah.
Because you have this machine now that is just doing its own thing.
Yeah. Yeah. With anything, was Uncle Ben from Spider-Man said, with great power comes great responsibility.
Yeah.
So with that being said, we understand that there is great power coming from what the technology is really growing to. And we are, let's say, at this 2.0 version, if you will, and don't quote me on those terms because I don't know if it's at 1.0
Sure.
or 3.0 or whatever, but not being an expert in it. But from your perspective, as we shift over a little bit to payments and the world that you live in and have grown up in and so on and so forth, what processes, procedures are you seeing in the payment ecosystem that are going to be more immediately affected by AI? And then from there, two-part question, how do you see the threat to the workforce itself in the payment industry? And you can actually expand that to the greater
Sure.
economy as well.
I mean, from a financial services standpoint, generative AI is not going to probably be that impactful when it comes to processing, right? And the reason being is because, I mean, if you've ever used any of the chat GPTs, Bards, etc., they will, what I guess the term that's been coined is hallucinate.
Right.
They'll give you an answer that it just made up. And, it's almost like the adage goes of, I read it on the internet, it must be true.
Right.
Like, so if it came from chat GPT, it must be true. Like, that's not necessarily the case.
And is ChatGPT just running through the entire internet to basically find data related to that, like in the Google machine, so to speak, to come up with its answer? Like a human being somewhere programmed something, and then this thing got smarter than the human being somehow by being able to analyze data and information and then bring it up. Even the false information is the problem.
Well, yeah, so it's inferring. And that's where it comes to the differences between really machine learning and generative AI.
Got it.
So
Got it.
the data points that they're mapping to are, like, at this stage, hundreds of millions at one time. So, the other thing that kind of plays into it is the ability to have advanced computing power too. So quantum computing is a new thing. It's coming, fast and furious, and that's also going to play a role in, what happens with some of these AI models also. So going back to the financial industry, if you really think about what's happening today, I mean, Visa can support, I think, 65,000 transactions per second. They have the ability within a few hundred milliseconds, and that's fractions of a second, to be able to determine if a transaction is likely fraud or not. And it's doing things like, hey, does he usually eat out on a Saturday? Does he, do you buy flowers often? Do you, what is your spending habit and what's your patterns typically as a consumer? And that's what they're doing when you get those fraud alerts. So if something goes out of pattern, if you will, that's when either the bank that's issuing the card or the networks will send a fraud score and say, hey, that's probably a potential fraudulent transaction. So, I mean, that's really the biggest use case, if you will, of AI in the financial services industry from a back office standpoint. And the reason being is because it's too risky to rely on generative AI to make a decision. Because what happens when it's wrong?
Right.
So the other side of the coin that not only people talk about is we have ChatGPT, but what about the bad actors? The fraud GPT or the chaos GPT. There's all these different ones that have been coined that are out there to I'll say wreak havoc and to try to commit fraud on the other side.
Right.
So that's really probably the biggest danger, if you will, to the financial industry. So not just ours, but just in general, banking, investments, across the board. And that's why you won't see generative AI really make its way into financial services from a back office perspective, I don't think anytime soon.
Got it. And when we're saying, hey, these, the fraud triggers exist today, there's a form of that exists today, is the idea that it speeds up that process, or it is identifying things before they even happen in a lot of cases. Because a human being arguably could make the same mistake, and that's something where, like, system with human being, this combination of machine,
Sure.
man, woman together is stronger than just a machine by itself or just a human being by themselves. So, like, does eventually the evolution take the human being out of the equation altogether to a certain extent.
So if you want to talk about, I'll say just transaction processing, no, it's too slow. Or you can't have it. I mean, those transactions are happening, and when I'm at a store, I expect it, pay with my card.
Right.
Within a second or two, I'm done. So there's no human intervention, I'll say, possible, right? The other part of the equation when it comes to some of the machine learning algorithms is, there's data and there's studies that's been done on false positives. So, hey, this was identified as fraud, and it declined the transaction, and maybe the consumer said, you know what, I'm just not going to shop here because they didn't want to deal with getting the text message from their bank and say, yes, that was me, and then going back and then putting it in again. They just abandoned the cart and left. So, like, that's the I'll say the flip side, if you will, of what's happening from a fraud monitoring perspective with some of the machine learning algorithms that are out there, is because at the end of the day, businesses are losing money because transactions are deemed fraudulent, but they're really not. So it's a balance. It's not there's no silver bullet.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting to see how this is going to continue to shift and evolve the back office as well as fraud in general, where you do have these characters that are trying to also, drag it down as they go into battle of the good versus the evil, so to speak. If I'm a software company, a developer, whatever, I own a software, I develop, I've heard a lot about the threat to development as it relates to AI and what's coming. This idea and concept of you really don't need a room of developers to build a software. You don't need to, it's going to be so smart that it'll just, create a software for you. It seems so far-fetched, knowing development, and it seems so far away as well. But talking about the software itself and what's possible within a software. So I'm a software provider offering software to businesses, to merchants. What is it that we should be looking for in the future? What opportunities do we have as well, right? It's kind of the SWOT concept of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And we're looking at kind of the back half, opportunities and threats, because we can't control those things necessarily. Although we could take an opportunity and say, hey, we should start to do this now or start to work on this now. What are you seeing there from the software perspective and what they should be focusing on?
I mean, the biggest thing that people don't necessarily realize is, the intellectual property component of what the AI is doing now from a generative perspective.
Yeah.
There's court cases out there that have been already ruled on that says anything created by generative AI can't be copyrighted.
Interesting. So like literally you get it from generative AI, you can't copyright it, which I would assume puts a little bit of a threat to people utilizing the generative AI, because now they lose their protection under the law. Okay.
So if you just use like ChatGPT, you go to the OpenAI website and try to use it to generate code, you can, and it works. And I mean, from what I've heard from some of the people that I know, is it helps them out quite to, I'll say, speed up development a lot. The challenge though that comes with it is you're asking a model that's being used by everybody, and you're feeding it data, and every time you feed it data, that becomes part of the brain. And it's not just Kevin's like slice of it. Next time you go on and you type in the same question I did, it's going to know that I like the answer and probably give you something similar.
Right.
So now I've lost a little bit of my edge, if you will, in my opinion, for what can be creative.
Right.
So I mean, that's the other component of it as well. I know GitHub, which is a platform that people use to check their code in, has services that say they protect against that, but it still comes back to, in my opinion, the intellectual property is a big deal. Now, if you write software and it's a service, is anybody really going to get a copy of it? No, because it's in within your organization. But if you have a bad actor internally and you have an employee that leaves and all of your code was generated by AI, and they just go stand up the same competitor next door to you with a new name and start selling it, you have no recourse.
Interesting.
Because you can't claim copyright on the code because it was written by AI.
Very interesting. And that's going to be an interesting world, because not just with code, we talked about papers earlier in the college student concept of who actually wrote this and how can you identify. So now a new company comes up that's going to be the ones that stop that from happening, right? And
Sure.
and you know, this is where I think there's this delicate dance of governing this with restricting the ability versus the moral side of, you know, those that are trying to be bad actors, and how do you stop those folks from damaging something good, right? One bad apple ruins a bunch is one of the problems.
I definitely think there's going to be some legislation that will probably change the rules.
Right.
You know, even from an intellectual property standpoint, I don't think it's going to last. I do believe at some point in the future, because if you think about all of the big tech companies out there and the influence they have, you know, from a government perspective as well, I think everyone would support probably changing that law, which is, you know, one of the beauties of what we can do here in the country.
Yeah.
Is if, you know, technology is changing, they can just rewrite the law quite literally and get it through. And now, hey, maybe my intellectual property is protected. But, you know, as you know, like, this is so new, it's going to take some time to catch up.
That's right. Yeah. People are going to have to trip a bunch of times. And a lot of those early adopters probably get, you know, big reward, of course, but also big risk is often what we see in those situations.
Sure.
So with that being said, let's go down to kind of the when I say down, like kind of downstream. You got the payment companies, you know, the software that we integrate to. Then we go down to the businesses that integrate to them. Is there anything that a business should be doing today that's like a must-do for AI? Like, hey, you know, because, or a starting point for them to start to get in. And I'm not just the business, also consumers, because when you think about it, a lot of consumers are also business owners. A lot of business owners are consumers. So it kind of works both ways. What should they be looking for, and how can they get their feet wet in the world of artificial intelligence?
I mean, I think the biggest thing, you know, you start talking about back office and how can you create efficiencies and do those things. There's a lot of ability. You mentioned form filling out earlier. I mean, that's kind of a big deal because, you know, filling out some forms is a tedious process that it's definitely something that can be automated.
Yeah.
Now, you also hear the other side of the coin of like, oh my God, we're going to lose, or, you know, if I'm one of those employees that's doing that job right now, am I going to lose my job? And the answer is really no, not yet. And probably not for quite some time. And the reason being is because, as I mentioned before, somebody still has to check it. You know, at the end of the day, it will make you more efficient. So in most situations that I've seen, you know, essentially what's going to happen is it's going to make that employee more efficient. So they can do more in less time.
Yep.
And from a service perspective, you start to go a little bit more customer facing. It's going to be, what can you do from a service? The chatbots, you know, there's already chatbots out there, and this is not necessarily new either. But when I type a question, it's going to infer what I'm looking for based on what I've typed in, and, you know, hopefully prompt me with what the answer is.
Sure.
You know, take that one step further. When I call in, you know, the voice we talked about, even just like, you know, Siri or Amazon's Alexa or, you know, Google's devices as well, and, you know, what those are doing just from a, you know, question answer perspective.
It's amazing to see, like, and there is this anxiety that comes from the idea of not fully being able to grasp the possibilities of the technology. And, you know, you listen to, you know, inflection points, you know, books that talk about inflection, but Only the Paranoid Survive is an example.
Sure.
And he was historically talking about, at the time when the internet was becoming a thing and the World Wide Web and electronic mail, all these terms now we laugh at because we're like, it's email and it's www, right? It's just the internet. And we're starting to see this shift as well, as this starts to become more common, that this is a inflection point of that would affect several different types of businesses across the board of how we do things as we continue to grow. The evolution and the shift over, as an example, to the offshore resource model, right? We saw a lot of that. You know, I see, as I look at it, this large threat to that, right? A lot of the offshore resource, you know, level one data entry, those types of things, I think could be kind of part of that, you know, 2.0, 3.0 scenario, where it's like, well, look, we're already seeing, when I go and I ask for customer service, I'm a chatbot.
For sure.
And I am going to walk you through this process. I've heard even some really powerful voice calls with, it's still not quite there. I mean, even in the VR world, when they're talking about kind of glasses, and we just heard Zuckerberg talk about what's coming as it relates to the new glasses and their partnership with Ray-Ban and so on and so forth. Like all of these things, VR, so on and so forth, there's all an element of artificial intelligence that are powering or experience-wise that are part of that environment.
Yeah, I mean, from my standpoint and my perspective, it's definitely be interested to see where some of those things head from the VR perspective too. It's definitely something that's going to be, I'll say, in some instances, life changing.
Yep.
Because you have people that have, I'll go down the disability path, and it's going to be really give them a sense of the ability to experience things they've never experienced too.
Sure.
So you start to think about, like, again, generating content from an AI standpoint. There's a lot of different things you can do kind of going down that path.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So. Yeah. For somebody that's new to the game, they don't know where to go. Obviously, there's YouTube. I could watch a bunch of videos. Sure. Any suggested areas to go and start to get familiar with the AI world?
I would recommend trying out the various ones out there. The three that I'll say use or try out, I'll say most often, is going to be ChatGPT, Bard, which is Google's, and then Claude.
Yeah.
And the other piece of it that I would say is really important that most people don't really understand or realize is there's this thing called prompting. So there's a website out there called learnprompting.org.
Learnprompting.org, okay.
And what it does is it teaches you how to set up your question for best success. So you can give it, context for your question and how you would like it to think about who you are from a persona perspective in some instances, to be able to give you, I'll say, the best answer possible. So, I was talking to my daughter who's in high school, and you talk about like schools and papers and stuff, and it's like, oh, I'm a 9th grade student in an English class, and I need to write this thing. And the reason you prompt it that way, and this is a very basic example, is because you want it to write in that style. So, again, learnprompting.org, that's probably a site that I would focus on.
Awesome. Kevin, it has been a pleasure speaking with you today. Learned a lot about AI. If anybody has any questions, feel free to message us. We'd be happy to get it over to Kevin for answers. Thank you for listening.
3 key takeaways from this podcast episode. Number 1, AI is here and will be a necessary step when growth is a key focus. Your manpower needs high-powered assistance, and the right AI tools can help you get to the answers faster. Kevin in the episode recommends starting now with ChatGPT, with Bard, and Claude. Number 2, we have to understand that there are dangers associated with AI, and will be some time before financial services may be utilizing generative AI. So keep in mind and be aware of copyright infringement, errors in AI responses, and different fraud AI models that are now wreaking havoc. And number 3, the future includes working closely with AI. So now is the time to aim your focus on keyword and prompt development, and look at learnprompting.org to help professionals discover the best answers for you and your business. Well, that's the episode of Embedded. If you have found value in this episode, please leave us a 5-star rating, subscribe to stay up to date on payments, software, and emerging technologies.